Hi everyone, and welcome to yet another virtual chemistry lesson, where we will cover part of the basics of electrochemistry, more specifically the basics of electrolytic cells. I will also then briefly mention fuel cells, but I won't go into those in detail. An electrolytic cell, that's the opposite, in a way, of a voltaic cell, because a voltaic cell, which I talked about in a previous video, uses spontaneous redox reactions to generate electricity and voltage. An electrolytic cell, however, uses electricity to force a non-spontaneous reaction. So voltaic cells, they use spontaneous reactions to generate electricity, and electrolytic cells, they use electricity to force non-spontaneous reactions. Often when you talk about the electrolytic cell, you talk about the main component, which is an electrolyte. That's a substance that conducts electricity due to the dissociated ions. So typically we have salt solutions, or sometimes we have molten ionic compounds at very high temperatures. And that's an electrolyte in chemistry. So we're going to look at a few reactions here. The first reaction is that between zinc and copper sulfate, that forms zinc sulfate and copper. And here you see the cell potential generated by a reaction like this. If you put it in a voltaic cell, it's 1.10 volts. It has a positive value, therefore we know that this is a spontaneous reaction, and we can use it in a voltaic cell. But if we were to try the opposite, we try to utilize the reaction between solid copper and zinc sulfate to generate solid zinc and copper sulfate, then the value, based on the equation, would be a negative version of the previous one up here. So the set potential is negative. That means that this is a non-spontaneous reaction. It will not happen, and it cannot be used, for example, to generate electricity. However, it is possible to force this reaction if we use a electrolytic cell. So here is a schematic of a electrolytic cell that looks very similar to the voltaic zinc copper cell that we looked at before, what's also called Daniel's cell. So in the previous video, when we had a simple battery, there was a light bulb up here, which a current passed through. Here now we've replaced the light bulb with a battery stronger than the one of zinc and copper. It has to have what I mean with stronger is that it has to have a higher potential than the zinc copper battery. So when we put a battery up here instead with a stronger potential, and we put the negative sign towards zinc, something interesting happens. We force electrons from the negative pole. The negative pole of a battery generates electrons, just like our voltaic cells did previously. So electrons are generated here, and since the potential is higher than the zinc copper battery, the electrons move down into the zinc electrode over here. These electrons, well, they correspond to a negative charge, and they can then come into contact with zinc ions at the surface here. And when zinc ions come into contact with electrons like this, we form solid zinc. That means that this electrode will increase in size and mass, of course. And this is a reduction. We have something gaining electrons. This is quite the opposite of the same setup, but for a voltaic cell, where zinc was oxidized instead. Let's look at the other half cell. A positive pole of a battery will attract electrons. So electrons will be pulled through here, from the copper metal through the wire and towards the positive pole of the battery. This force, and as copper atoms then lose their electrons, being pulled away by the positive pole of the battery, they will split apart from this copper electrode as copper ions and out into solution. So when copper atoms lose electrons, when they're pulled away in this fashion, we can write the following formula. We see that the copper electrode decreases in both size and mass because the actual metal piece is slowly converted into ions. They are dissolved into solution, so it will decrease slowly over time. This is an oxidation going on. So, just like in a voltaic cell, whenever we had a metal being reduced, we call that a cathode. Whenever we had a metal that's oxidized, we call that an anode. But if we have this setup of an electrolytic cell, which looks just like the voltaic cell we used previously, we will switch which side is oxidized, and therefore the anode, and which side is reduced, and therefore the cathode. And I urge you to remember the mnemonic rule, AN-OX. Anode, oxidation, and then red cat, reduction at the cathode. So please compare this to the other schematic I had like this in the voltaic cell video, and you will see that it's switched around, so to speak. So, why do we want to do this? What is electrolyzers good for? Electrolyzers doesn't have to be used in a setup like the previous section where we had two different half cells. That was just included to show you that it's sort of the opposite of a voltaic cell. So I set it up the same way as the voltaic cell and then illustrated the differences. But you can just do electrolysis in single cells if you want to, and in single beakers. For example, if we have a beaker here and we pour copper chloride solution in there, we will get a nice amount of copper ions and chloride ions, and these are not in any way incorrect ratios to one another, but just to illustrate, there's way more in here. Then we connect a battery to two carbon electrodes, and you get to enjoy my fantastic PowerPoint drawing skills here. But a carbon electrode pretty much looks like a black rod. But the interesting thing is it's not a metal. It will not behave like the metals we do. It will only allow passage of electrons. So the electrodes here will be unchanged themselves. Just they can only transfer electrons through them. And they're pretty much black rods. Connect them to a wire and a battery, and let's see what happens. Well, the negative pole of a battery generates electrons. Therefore, the electrons will be pushed down through this conductive material, the carbon electrode, down into the solution. At the same time, electrons will be pulled through this right-hand carbon electrode towards the positive cell of the battery. So, is there a way for us to circulate these charges so it works? Well, there is something over here that can take care of excess electrons, and that is the copper ions we have in solution. And when there's a buildup of electrons in this electrode, this system will want to try and minimize that, and copper ions will react with the excess electrons. And then slowly over time, you will see, and actually fairly quickly, you'll start to see solid copper being formed at the surface of this electrode. Here's the reaction. Copper reacts and takes up electrons, which is a reduction. A solid copper is formed. On the right-hand side of this simple electrolytic cell, electrons are pulled, right? So we need to get electrons from somewhere, and the only source of these excess electrons are the chloride ions, because they've gained as many electrons as they possibly can. They have already been as reduced as they possibly can. So they can be forced to oxidize back to what they were before. the copper ions here, they wouldn't be possible for them to give away any extra electrons after this stage because they've already oxidized as much as they possibly can to form ions. But the chloride ions, they have additional electrons that can be provided to this electrode. And they have to be forced to do this, of course, but that's why we put up a potential here. We pull electrons away from the chloride ions. And if we do that, this is an oxidation, and it will actually start to bubble. This type of this is a drawing, but if you were to do this, you would see the typical yellowish gas of chlorine gas being formed. So it would start to bubble at the surface of this electrode with the toxic gas chlorine. This is interesting. By applying electricity to a solution of an ionic compound, we can, over time, convert all of that salt, all of that ionic compound, back to its corresponding elements. So we can make solid copper and chlorine gas by applying electricity to a solution like this. And that's pretty much what electrolyzers mean. Electro stands for electrons and lysis stands for breaking up. So it's something that we're breaking up with electricity, and in this case then we're breaking up the solution with electricity. Right. However, this is not exclusive to just ionic compounds. It can also be used to convert molecules like water down into its corresponding elements. Water is a molecule that consists out of hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. Sorry, it's a molecule that consists out of hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. And when we apply electricity to water like this through, for example, carbon electrodes, we can break down the water into hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. By giving energy to water, we can break it down. So we need a salt or an acid. A salt or an acid to provide a good conductivity in this water, because we need a way to circulate the charges, and ions is a perfect way of transferring these charges. And if you put the acid in water, you will get oxonium ions and a corresponding negative ion that will then allow you to conduct electricity in a good way. And you can do this in, for example, a Hofmann electrolysis apparatus, where you can refill with water up here on the top, which goes down to here. As you apply a voltage over this, we will have gases being formed. The water will sort of go away as we will have an increased volume of gases up here. On one side, we will have oxygen gas, and the other side we will have hydrogen gas. And that is because at the surface of the electrodes, the gases are being formed, and then since they're separated so far away from each other, the bubbles of one of the gases will go up here, and the bubbles of the other gas will go up here. So what will be oxidized and what will be reduced when you break down water like this? Think about that for a moment. Well, since electrons travel from the negative pole of a battery here, this is where we will have a build-up of electrons. So you need to think about, will hydrogen in water or oxygen in water take up extra electrons? Well, the oxidation number will go from +1 of the hydrogens in a compound to 0 as hydrogen in an element. So that will be a decrease in oxidation number, and that will correspond to a reduction. So the reduction will take place over here, and this is where hydrogen gas will then form. On this side, this is where oxygen will go from a negative oxidation number, 2-, to 0 as oxygen gas. That means that it increases, so it has to oxidize. So oxygen gas will be here as oxygen in water donates electrons. Once we generated the gases up here, hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, these gases can then be used as, for example, fuel in a fuel cell. And here is another very interesting use of electrolysis. It's called electroplating. So imagine that you have a copper anode in a copper sulfate solution. You add a battery and a metal cathode. Then you can force copper to cover the surface of the other metal. At first, the copper will come from the solution as we build up electrons in this electrode over here. The positive ions meet up with them. But over time, as more and more of the copper anode is being dissolved and goes into copper ions, it sort of refills ions here as we go along, as long as we have copper. And then eventually it will be the anode that is being sort of plated onto the cathode in this way. This is very useful if we, for example, want to have iron nails covered with zinc so they're resistant to rust, for example. We can put iron nails into a solution and then use electrolysis to cover them with zinc. So there's a whole trove of uses for this. You could plate gold onto materials in just a thin layer, making them appear as they're made of gold, but it will only be a thin gold layer at the surface. All right, and then very quickly, the fuel cell. We're not going to go into the details here, but you can build a well thought through construction like this, where you can directly convert chemical energy from a combustion process into electrical energy. The fuel will be oxidized by the anode, and the oxidizing agent will be reduced by the cathode. And we sort of capture the electrons of this reaction through a wire, and then we can use that to generate an electric current. In this case, we have hydrogen gas as a fuel and oxygen gas as well as an oxidizing agent. And we have electrodes of a certain porous material, metal or graphite, that can let through the gases. We also need a form of catalysator, which is something we haven't talked about yet. But there's quite a few things involved here. We need electrolyte, something for that we can have charges traveling through as well. So we're not going to go into this, but so you know, we can use the hydrogen gas and oxygen gas used in an electrolytic cell. And then we can, via a smart construction, put it back into a fuel cell and then use that energy somewhere else. And that's the video for today. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.